This is Join Us in France, episode 348. 348. Bonjour, I'm Annie Sargent, and Join Us in France is the podcast where we look around France so you can best enjoy France as a destination. We talk about French culture, news, history, gastronomy, and everything it takes to have a great time in France. Today, I bring you a conversation with Elyse Rivin about Montauban, Montauban, not far from Toulouse. It's a minor city that you might have considered if you visited the southwest of France several times. I've been there a million times, so it was high time we talked about it. After my chat with Elyse about Montauban, I will also update you on the COVID situation in France and share news for people who are planning trips to France this year in 2021. Lots to say, so this is going to be a long episode. If you like what we do here at Join Us in France, consider supporting us by visiting joinusinfrance.com/boutique to check out my cookbook, tours, and services such as my itinerary reviews, where I help you craft the best vacation in France specifically for you. Follow Addicted to France on Instagram to see my photos of Montauban. I'll post them this week. The best way to stay in touch with me and with the podcast is to sign up for the newsletter at joinusinfrance.com/newsletter. Bonjour Elyse.
Bonjour Annie.
I see that you have prepared quite a few pieces of paper to tell us about Montauban.
Yes, actually, in spite of the fact that I thought I really knew Montauban very well, it's always amazing to me how much work is involved in getting down the details and remembering all the things that are important to talk about.
Yep. And Montauban has a lot to, as far as history is concerned.
Yes, it's really more almost about the history. In other places, it's more about what you see now. But in the case of a small city like Montauban, it's really more about why it's important in the history of France.
Yeah. So it's funny because Montauban, I've been going there my whole life, literally, because I have first cousins who grew up in Montauban. But of course, when you go visit your cousins, you just see that one street, right?
That's right.
You go all the time, but you just see that the places where we went biking and stuff like that as a kid, you know? And so I hadn't been to downtown Montauban in a long time. And I went yesterday for the first time in a long time. And I also visited my elderly uncle who... he's getting old. Yeah, you know, it's what happens. But it was lovely to see him and to hoof around the city center. And
well, it's not.
I didn't fall in love with Montauban.
You didn't fall in love with Montauban.
No, I did not.
No, Montauban is a kind of the cousin that nobody kind of really is passionate about, I have to say.
Well, the thing is, to me, as far as their infrastructure is concerned, they are about where Toulouse was 20 years ago.
Probably, yeah.
Or 30 years ago, even possibly. I mean, like, okay, in Toulouse, the banks of the river Garonne used to be where people went to park.
Right.
It was parking lots. And that's exactly what it is today in Montauban. So they haven't beautified their lovely board, you know, the
It is lovely, actually.
It is lovely.
It's really lovely.
It could be absolutely beautiful, but it's nothing but parking lots.
No.
And it's just not good, you know. The city is all torn up, but that's temporary.
That's temporary.
Right. But they have problems with their infrastructure, let's put it this way. And they are working on it. And I'm sure they will fix those things, but yeah, it wasn't ideal for taking photos. You know, I don't know what it is with construction people, but they have a knack for putting their mess in front of the pretty stuff.
Well, maybe they do it on purpose. I don't know. You know, maybe they want to be in the photo. You never know.
Maybe they do.
But okay, so let's back up by starting to explain that Montauban is a city. It's a small city, but it's actually, I was surprised because it has expanded a lot. It's about 79,000 people.
Yeah.
And it's 55 kilometers north of Toulouse. Mm-hmm. It's a short train ride away or not very long drive by car. And it is one of the triad of what are called the three brick cities.
Yeah.
And the three brick cities are Toulouse, Albi, and Montauban.
Lots of red brick.
Lots of beautiful
lots
red brick.
of it,
right.
yes.
It's you can call it Toulouse brick because we claim it, to be first, but it is the same brick. It's this very beautiful Roman brick, and it's really known as being the third. And actually, when you think about it, Toulouse is the biggest. Albi is a little bit bigger than Montauban and much more dynamic, I guess, in a certain culturally speaking anyway.
Yes,
and then you have Montauban.
But Albi and Toulouse have a lot of charm to them.
Yes.
Right now, the charm to Montauban is hard to see.
Well,
it will get better.
It will get better. Montauban is a place that's a good place. As you mentioned, I think it's a very good place to stop if you're doing something else not far away. You can go from there to a place we're going to talk about in another podcast soon, which is Moissac, or you can go to one of the villages that are up going towards the Aveyron area because they're not very far away. So it is a place that you can stop in. It's a good place to stop for a couple of things. One is the museum, which you didn't go into. There is a museum there that has just actually been renovated. It's in the old Bishop's Palace, so it backs onto the
river?
The river. I mean, the river is down below and across the street, but you can see that it's built up high on the hill. It's actually a hill right there that's along the Tarn. It's the Tarn River that's right there. And there's an affluent of it called the Técou. But the art museum there is very well known, particularly in the Southwest, because it's a museum that has a very big collection of drawings and paintings by a very important painter from the 19th century in France named Ingres.
Yeah.
Ingres, who is a painter of a very particular style.
Was he from there?
He was born and raised in Montauban.
Okay,
that's why. And he, in fact, the museum exists since 1851. It's actually a very old museum. He gave the city of Montauban a big collection. In fact, he was primarily a portrait painter. Wonderful portraits, a bit in a very classical, very polished style, but hyper-realistic. They're gorgeous in terms of the skill of the painting. And he was also known for doing mythological scenes. And we have a couple of those here in one of the museums here in Toulouse, in the Augustin. I personally find his style a little bit too rigid, but his skill was phenomenal, and he was a fabulous drawer. I never know how to use it. Even in English, it's a hard word to say. And he left the city of Montauban 4,500 drawings.
Wow.
Some major paintings and a bunch of other pieces of his personal collection. And he gave it to the city. He died at the age of 87. He was a nice old man who had managed to have a good career and lived half of his life in Rome and half of his life in Paris once he left art school, which he did here. But he was nostalgic for his hometown. And so they took the building, which, of course, like all of these buildings after the revolution, was no longer a bishop's house. I don't know what happened to the bishop. He was sent somewhere or whatever. Yeah. And they turned it into a museum. So a lot of people go there to visit the museum. But while they do, it's worth it. Now, of course, you were there yesterday and they're doing all this work, which is unfortunate because it's also famous for this central square called the National Square.
Yeah.
And it's very beautiful because it's all this gorgeous red brick, and it's a very interesting style of architecture because they cut the angles off, and there's a whole history to the city center. And so it's worth it for what I would say is a couple of hours. If you walk around a little bit, you can visit a couple of churches, although you told me that Saint-Jacques is closed. I'm not sure why. But obviously...
Okay, I can tell you why.
Why?
Because I read the notice on the front. Because of neglect. They let things go so bad for so long that they think the roof might cave in.
Okay.
It's dangerous. And so the city had to condemn the building and say, until you fix it, nobody can go in there.
So this is Saint-Jacques.
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
It's horrible. I'm telling you, they are very, very behind as far as taking care of their stuff. La Place Nationale. So you have this plaza. It looks like the whole plaza sank.
Yeah, it did a little bit.
A little bit, like by a meter.
By a meter, yeah.
It's horrible. And so you have all these, it's like big waves of asphalt where you can see where it sank down, and they've painted big yellow X's on top so people notice it and don't fall. They have to completely redo it. Now, I can see why it would be very pleasant, because once it's all nice and smooth and flat, it'll be great, because all these arcades are beautiful.
Yes.
The buildings surrounding are beautiful. There's a couple that are boarded up. The windows are boarded up, but I'm sure they'll work on that. That's minor compared to the massive infrastructure that they have to do for the surface of the plaza. They have some nice restaurants around there.
Oh, yes, they do.
You know, I had my lunch there. It's pleasant.
Right.
It's a pleasant town. The weather is good, like it is mostly in the southwest of France. It's just that both the cathedral is closed because they dug up a huge parking lot. They are way behind on parking. They have a parking problem. They let all these people park for free along the river, which they should not do. And so the people around there have gotten into the habit. I was like that when I was younger. I know this. This is how Toulouse was. You could always park for free along the river. So the river is always, it's just nothing but cars. And so they dug up this nice big parking lot by the cathedral,
which is right in front of the cathedral.
Right. There are 0 underground parking lots in Montauban. I looked for one because I didn't want to have to go back and feed the meter.
Right.
Okay. So I wanted to just go in an underground parking lot, stay there 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever. All I could find was places where you had to leave after 30 minutes. And I didn't want to do that. So I found a place where I didn't have to pay. But see, that just shows that they're not thinking about what people actually want to do in the city. They think people are cheap and don't want to pay. But I would rather pay and not have to hoof it from the river up to the town, because it's a hike.
Yeah, it's a hike.
Yeah. And, just stuff like that. Anyway, so they dug up this massive parking lot and started to build it. And it looks like it's about halfway done. The problem is now the facade of the cathedral is pulling away from the rest of the building.
Which is terrible.
It is leaning down towards the parking lot.
Oh, dear.
And now my uncle told me that they are suing. Everybody's suing everybody to see who's going to have to pay for this, because the city gave permits. Maybe the company that did the engineering to see if this was safe didn't do a good job. We don't know yet. They're being sued. It's going to take years. Okay. And the other big church, Saint-Jacques. Well, I would have liked to see the inside, but it says it might cave in at any minute, so it's not safe to walk in. Okay, so this does not give a good impression of a town.
Well, the fact is, of course, Montauban is really unlike Albi. And even unlike Toulouse, it is not a touristy town. It really is not.
But it could be.
But it could be on a much smaller scale.
Yes.
It has a very rich history. The thing about Montauban is that it's extremely important in the history of France in general, and particularly a certain period of history in France. And it's also a town that had an enormous importance and was very, very wealthy, even into the 19th century, and then lost all of its influence because most of the economic advantages it had disappeared. And so I know someone who grew up there, who's closer to our age and a little younger, and he said, even 25 years ago, it was basically what you would call a depressed area. And it's come back. It's just that I think it's going to take them a while to bring it back. And it's a shame because, as you say, I've been there a few times. I've been there to visit the museum with groups. I've been there on other occasions, and I've had lunch along in one of the cafes or restaurants on this National Square. It's charming.
Yeah, that's charming.
There's a great market there, one day a week.
That part is nice.
It's really nice. And of course, all of that.
There's no market right now because it's all
there's
torn
no
up.
market. There's nothing there right now. But it's a shame because there are small cities like that really have a rich heritage and have some buildings that are really interesting. And it takes, I guess, a certain amount of money to put everything back together.
And foresight also, and political leadership, because, their mayor is a nutcase. Have you seen her on TV?
No.
Okay. She was the hydroxychloroquine queen of the universe.
Was she? Oh,
yeah,
really?
She's afraid that the vaccine is going to implant a chip in you.
Oh,
she is a nutcase.
Okay.
And these people voted for her, okay?
Well,
so there's a problem.
Okay. All right. Well,
I'm trying to be subtle, but
right,
no.
yeah.
And I have cousins. I have one of my first cousins still lives there, and she has a cute little house, and she's a teacher there, and it's all fine. But her two sisters got the hell out.
Yeah. Well, it's also for work, you have to have
And my uncle landed there because he was he worked for the French administration. He didn't have a choice. Okay. So he did his whole career there. He knows all the mayors and because he was directeur de la protection civile was his job. So it's not like I have no links to the city. I think it would be I would much prefer to say that it's charming and that you should go. But right now, all I can say is it has problems. They'll fix themselves. So I'm very glad that you're going to tell us about the history, because the history is really what's going to hopefully bring them back.
Exactly. Really, because it's really something, it's actually quite astounding when you go and start reading about it. And it's like, what happened? Because reading about it, it's like, oh, wow. This was really an important city for a very long time, and the question is like, where did that important city go?
Yeah,
basically.
Yeah.
So so Montauban it's on the Tarn, which is a major river, big river in the southwest, and it is actually at a place. It's on a couple of hills. It's at a place where there are the big Tarn and two small rivers actually meet together. But the Montauban goes back to the founding of a Benedictine monastery, which was in the 800s, which means it's very, very old. And the monastery was called Montauban, and it was up on a hill, and the town grew up basically around it. Now, this is very typical in the early Middle Ages. You either have a church first or a castle first with a lord, and then the town basically develops around one or the other.
But it's also a bastide.
No. See, that's what's so interesting about it. So it looks like a bastide, it smells like a bastide, but it ain't a bastide because this is why. And this is what makes it so interesting. In the year 1144, okay, so 100 years before the Bastides were started, because that was an official beginning of a development of new towns. In the year 1144, well, we're talking about, 900 years ago, right? Mm-hmm. The Count of Toulouse at the time, his name was Alphonse Jourdain. He took a piece of land next to the Benedictine Abbey. Now, remember, this is part of the lands of the Counts of Toulouse, which was really a kingdom. I mean, they were counts instead of dukes, and I don't know why they were counts instead of dukes, but they might as well have called them a king, And he created from scratch a new town on the Roman system, which is a grid system. And it was in order to make sure that he had control over this part of the territory, which in those days was far enough away that the people who lived nearby had no protection in relation to the city of Toulouse. It was not called a Bastide. He simply created a new city, and he built it on a grid system because that was the tradition of the Roman cities, and that was what he wanted to do. Now, what's really interesting is that it looks like what we call a Bastide, which is also built on a grid system, but it was not with that in mind at all. It's very strange because he did that in 1144, and it was in 1229, so really almost 100 years later, that one of his descendants started the first Bastide.
Okay, so maybe it was a precursor to
It was a
Bastide.
precursor.
Yeah.
It's considered to be the city that was the model for all of the Bastides. And the Bastides, as we've talked about them before, the Bastides are these new cities where the central part is a marketplace as opposed to a church, and they only exist in the southwest of France. So it was really something that was in this area, in this region, going all the way into Aquitaine, but it doesn't exist in the southeast. It doesn't exist in the north of France. These kinds of towns don't exist anywhere else. But yes, it is on a grid. It is really perfectly gridded in the city center, the old city center, but it's actually almost 100 years older than even Cordes Sociales, which is one of the oldest Bastides created in 1229. So it's very strange because he didn't intend to use this and start a whole bunch of other cities. He just built Montauban, and he designated one of his lords, to run Montauban, to be loyal to him, so that he would have, because we're still in heavy feudal times.
Yeah.
And everything is protected and everything is fortified, and they're beginning to worry about the invasion of the English. Mm-hmm. And the English invaded. And the English came around and they bothered everybody. But between those two times, we have the 1200s, where we have this famous, basically, civil war with the Cathars. And Montauban really was part of the group of cities that were more Cathars than not.
Okay.
So what happened was, it happens that Montauban also has a history, and this goes right up through into World War II, unfortunately, of being a city that gets invaded and attacked persistently through history. So it was attacked and invaded by the French army during the war with the Cathars, because it was majority of people who were Cathars. And the first set of ramparts were destroyed. In the 1300s, the ramparts, because there were walls, it wasn't necessarily huge walls, but there were walls around the old gridded part of the city, they were rebuilt. And then the Prince Noir, the English, they came through marauding, coming from the west, coming from Aquitaine, and they invaded Montauban. And Montauban is really, it's almost like it's designed to be invaded by different groups that come through from one direction or another. And so what happened was that in the 1300s, between the English and the French, it was occupied by the English. They took it over. And they actually stayed in the city center for almost 50 years. So it became dominantly English, which of course we know means that it was French people who were loyal to the English king, to the crown, just like with other histories. It's not people who necessarily spoke English. And then, right after that, Montauban was devastated by the plague.
Ah, yeah.
Which, unfortunately, was something that happened in Toulouse also. But
a lot of places,
particularly in Montauban, in the year 1348, apparently half the population disappeared because of the plague.
This was a bubonic plague.
The bubonic plague, yeah.
The same one that had started in Marseille.
The same one that started in Marseille, yeah. Is there another kind? I don't know if there's another kind.
Very often they say a plague, but they don't mean the bubonic plague. They just mean some terrible...
La peste.
Some terrible pestilence.
Pestilence, right. No, this is the bad one. This is the one that killed everybody. So basically Montauban, which was more or less affluent, the reasons that Montauban was affluent were it had a silk industry. Mm-hmm. It had a lot of textile industry, and also because it's the confluence of three rivers, one tiny, one medium-sized, and then the Tarn, which is big, it was known for having mills that ground the wheat, because the wheat is grown a lot in the region all around it, and actually still is. And so it was very rich even in that time in the Middle Ages. But unfortunately, it had one invasion after the other, and then the pest. And then we get to the beginning of the 1500s. And this is what happens. And this is the period of time that's the most important actually in this history of Montauban. The 16th century, the 1500s. This is the time of the development of what's called in French the Reformed Church.
Yeah.
Protestantism.
Yes.
Calvinism, to be more exact. Not Lutheranism, but Calvinist church. And Montauban...
And there's a bunch of them.
And Montauban for reasons I do not know. Really, it's very interesting to try and know why, but I have no idea how you find out why. But Montauban, along with 2 or 3 other cities, and one we've talked about already, and that is La Rochelle, became majority Protestant.
Yeah.
And it became the head place. I'm losing my words today. The headquarters of one of the Protestant groups, and they created a university, a Protestant university in Montauban. And because the influence was so enormous in the entire region, the French king, and of course the people who were very Catholic, decided that it could not stay Protestant. And what had happened was, unfortunately, because this is true in a lot of places, because the city was majority Protestant, at some point they actually told the priests that were Catholic that they could no longer have Mass. And when the word got back to the French king, they decided to send an army down to attack the city of Montauban. And so in the year 1562, a huge army came down to attack the city of Montauban because it had become majority Protestant and was not allowing Catholic priests to perform Mass. And there were, in this 1 year, 3 major attacks on the city. And they destroyed all of the walls around the city, all of them. The Catholics had left, but because the army was now controlling the city, the Catholics were allowed back in. But what happened was that in the 1550s, 1560s, and 1570s, it's also true that there was a lot of bad blood here in Toulouse. What happened was that the city, which had become literally 100% Protestant, because they basically told the Catholics to go somewhere else. Unfortunately, the opposite happened here in Toulouse. The Protestants were told to go somewhere else. What happened was that they started to starve out the population. And the king, who was Charles IX, basically told the population of Montauban that if they did not sign a treaty and allow the Catholics to come back in, that they would simply raze the city.
Wow.
And it was a city of 30,000 people. It was a really important city in the middle of the 1500s, and it was a wealthy city. So it had a lot of very influential people, and basically what happened is very interesting. I made a note to myself. I thought, is this considered to be getting bought out, or is this just facing reality? What happened was that after a siege that lasted for quite a long time, there was this famous battle called the Battle of 96 Days, or the 400 Blows of Montauban. When you go to that church you can't get into anymore, the Church of Saint-Jacques, there are holes all over it. Those are musket holes from the rifles from the middle of the 1500s that were firing because the Protestants had gone into the church, gone all the way up to the tower on the top of the church, and were firing at the French army from up above. So you can still see the places where the fighting was on the walls of the church, and the church is a very, very old church. But
that's the one that has the big ceramic in the front.
Yes, which is 19th century. It's actually kind of neat.
It's cool looking.
It's cool looking, you know.
Yeah.
So this is what happened. There were 4 Protestant or Huguenot cities. We've talked about this a little bit because I know some people have written back and said, yes, they're from, their ancestors were Huguenots who'd gone to North America and things like that. The 4 Huguenot cities in France were La Rochelle, Cognac, Montauban, and a city called La Charité-sur-Loire, which is the only one that I've never been to.
I've never been to that one either.
I have no idea exactly if it...
And I intend to go to Cognac in August.
And it's lovely. And
I would
really
enjoy
lovely.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Charente is really beautiful. And what happened was, before this attack on Montauban, there had been an attempt to say, okay, you can control certain cities, but don't chase the Catholics out. We'll try and see if we can all live together. It didn't work out very well. And so the only thing that worked towards peace for a while was the fact that Henry IV was made king. And we talked about him a lot before because Henry IV is the one person who was basically from the south. He was originally from Navarre, which means he was from the Pyrenees, and he was brought up to be Protestant.
Right.
His mom was a very fervent Protestant. She really was. And he converted to Catholicism to have his crown. The kingdom is worth a conversion, right? But he made the Edict of Nantes. And the Edict of Nantes was one of the first documents in Western European history that had to do with freedom of religion and tolerance of all religions. And he signed the Edict of Nantes in 1596, which allowed everybody to worship who they wanted to, and basically things calmed down a little bit. But unfortunately, he got assassinated 14 years later by a fanatic.
Yeah.
And what happened
Catholic fanatic.
That his son, Louis XIII, was brought up as a Catholic and a very religious Catholic. And his son didn't want to have anything to do with this religious tolerance and Edict of Nantes, and he revoked it. And so what happened was...
And I think you can see La Révocation de l'Édit de Nantes at the archives, in the Marais. In the Marais. Les Archives Nationales. That's one of the displays.
Yeah, and I know that some of my husband's ancestors were involved in that because they're a Huguenot family.
Yeah.
You know, so it for them it's very strange. You talk to people like them, I mean the older generation anyway, and it's like it all happened yesterday. It's very weird.
Oh, yeah,
you know,
yeah.
I mean this is stuff that stays, unfortunately. I think it stays too long in people's minds, but whatever. That's my own personal opinion.
Yeah.
And so Louis XIII sent his army under the orders of Richelieu. I don't like Richelieu. He may have been powerful, but I'll tell you, I hate Richelieu because he was not a nice guy. He was very wealthy and he was powerful.
I don't like him either, but only because I've read Alexandre Dumas.
Yeah, well, you know, I mean, there are lots of reasons not to like him. But he was brilliant and powerful, and he was ruthless.
Yeah.
And he sent his army down because they'd already reconquered La Rochelle, and they sent them down to Montauban, and they fought for 96 days. 96 days, and they basically starved the city out. And what happened was that half the population left. They just left. They went either somewhere else in the southwest, or they got on a ship and went
wherever they could.
But literally, half the city disappeared after the 96 days of battle. And what happened was...
And you know what? We still see migrants like that today who
yes,
have
I
to
know.
leave their homes
because of something.
Because of religious problems. It's not like it has stopped happening.
I know.
But in France, it's been a long time.
It's been a long time. But this battle is very famous because the Protestants who were left in the city, they held out 96 days, which is an enormous amount of time when you think about it. They were up on the top of the towers of the church, of every wall. But they finally surrendered. They just finally gave up, which is not surprising under the circumstances. They were outpowered, they were outnumbered, and everything else. But Richelieu, he really was a very clever and intelligent person. And I'm sure it was him, and I don't think it was Louis XIII, because I don't get the impression that he was all that up in there in the brain part, you know. He told the people who ran the city that if they accepted the welcoming back of the Catholics and they opened up the churches, that he would give the city major advantages, financial advantages, that would make them the financial center for the whole region around there. And these people were not idiots. And they said, okay. And basically, those people who stayed in Montauban and didn't flee, they wound up becoming very wealthy, because what happened was, after that, in the 1600s, it was the time that Montauban was the richest city in the area. And he gave them the right to tax all the little towns in the area, that they were the ones that controlled all the finances. And so they basically bought back Montauban. And that's why it's so strange to think of Montauban being a kind of, you know, a little bit down on its heels kind of city today. Most of the Protestants eventually did leave. The city became very wealthy with its trade on the river, with its silk trade, and with everything else.
And the river is very wide at that point.
It's very wide. It's really very beautiful down there.
Yeah, it's very nice. Yeah, I have several photos of the. It was very cute. I was taking photos of the bridge on one side.
Yes. Did you see the beautiful old bridge?
Yeah. And oh no, this was in Moissac. Never mind.
Okay.
But there is the river is very wide and very beautiful.
And there's a beautiful old bridge there on the river. Yeah.
Yes.
And after this, they built this cathedral in Montauban, the one that you say is now having the front of its kind of collapse on itself.
It's kind of a white stone.
It's a Baroque cathedral.
Yeah.
It was built at the very end of the 17th century. There's a fabulous, huge painting inside that was a painting of Louis the 13th. It's a really famous painting that's on the inside. And it was the last major cathedral to be built in France. There have been renovations of things in the 19th century, but it was really the last major cathedral to be. And the city went back to being Catholic. Mm-hmm. And basically, this is not an uncommon thing. It's very strange. So now, the National Square is actually from the 1600s. Mm-hmm. It looks like it could be older because the original grid and the original buildings all were disappeared in all these centuries of battle, left and right. So basically what we see when you go there now are beautiful brick buildings that are all pretty much from the 1600s. The Bishop's Palace, which is now the museum, the square, the buildings around the square, the Préfecture, which is also an old building. All of those buildings are from some time in the 1600s. And then Napoleon liked Montauban. You love Napoleon. I'm not sure why he liked Montauban so much. I really have no idea. But what happened was...
I wouldn't say I love Napoleon. I'm interested.
You're interested in Napoleon. Yes. You're interested in Napoleon.
Yeah.
Napoleon was the person who created the departments in France.
Sure.
And what had happened is that during the Revolution, the Bishop's Palace had been confiscated. That's when it was turned into a secular kind of building. But they had taken Montauban. This is very weird. This is very much a sort of governmental thing for people who've traveled all over France. They had taken Montauban and they decided to put it into the Department of the Lot.
Oh, well, no.
Why? I don't know.
No.
Okay.
Ça va pas marcher.
No. So when Napoleon came into power in 1808, he liked I don't know why. I don't know what his attachment was to Montauban. He said, no. I'm going to create a new department. I'm going to take a little bit from this and a little bit from that, and I'm going to make a new department called Tarn-et-Garonne, and I'm going to make the head of it Montauban.
Yeah, Tarn-et-Garonne.
So that's why it is the head of the department called the Tarn-et-Garonne.
Number 81.
Thanks to little old Napoleon himself, Yeah. And what has happened is the only other thing to talk about really in terms of the history, because it's a small city that basically at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century had nothing particularly special about it, is that unfortunately it was also a city that was really martyrized by the Germans during World War II. It's a city that had welcomed a huge influx of Spanish people fleeing Franco.
Yeah.
So between 1936 and 1939, there were a huge number of immigrants. So it was a city that had a very mixed population, and it was a city that had a fair number of resistance. And by the way, besides the cardinal who had been Archbishop of Toulouse named Saliège, the Bishop of Montauban, and I'm embarrassed to say I don't remember his name, he was the only other bishop in all of France to speak out against deportation. So Montauban was clearly a city with a heritage like Toulouse of resistance and of not particularly complying with the occupying forces because it had lived through so many of these. And in 1944, there was a huge, huge battle in Montauban as the Germans were retreating. And there were terrible reprisals because the resistance had decided to move into the city to see if they could do a lot of attacking, which is mostly what happened, of course, in 1944. And there was one final battle, which is reminiscent of what had happened 300 years before, where the resistance took over all the buildings and fought for several days, and eventually the Germans just left. And so for them, that was their day of liberation. It was a day in August of 1944. But what has happened since is that basically it became just a sleepy little city. Mm-hmm. And it's a shame because it has a wonderfully rich history. Now, what it doesn't have is a nice museum to talk about all of this. Mm-hmm. It would be really good if at least a section of the museum that they have, because it's an art museum, it would be nice if they had a small section that really talked about the importance of the history of Montauban, because it really has a lot to do with the history of France in general.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I don't know why they don't. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot that they could do. I mean, this is a city with a lot of potential.
It's a lot, yeah.
But they really need to get their act together, and they have some very basic structural issues that they need to solve.
Yeah,
And first of all is the idea that we want to get rid of all those cars in the city center. You cannot. In Europe, the cities that thrive are the ones that get rid of the cars.
Yeah.
If you let cars take over your city center, you are doomed. And Montauban is a great example of that. You cannot be friendly to either the people who live there or the visitors when you let the cars go wherever they want, including the banks of the river.
Right.
No, don't do that. So, but of course you can't just tell people to stop using their cars. You have to give them something else.
Right.
You have to give them parking lots that are in areas where it's not an eyesore. You have to give them public transportation. You have to build around some ideas of, how a city should work, and they don't have it.
I have no idea, to be honest. I mean, it could be. I know that the parking along the river, of course, is down below. You have to go up into the old city. Mm-hmm. I have no idea if it has to do with the geology of the city or what. I don't know why they haven't done anything. If you go to Albi,
it's mentality.
There's a part of it there is a parking down below, but it's not right in the city center. So it doesn't hit the city center itself,
It's a whole mentality change. People who just want to hang on to their cars and their habits and you can't have it both ways.
Right.
You can't have a beautified city that's full of cars parked everywhere.
It's a shame because it has some really interesting buildings. It has a lot of rich history.
Yeah, it doesn't have that many half-timbered houses and stuff like that. Very few.
Well, that's what I'm saying. It's 1600s. Yeah, 1600s is basically beautiful brick classical architecture.
And I mean, they tore everything up. It looks like every street is being torn up right now.
Well, I was there just a few weeks ago, and I just remember the National Squares was being worked on, but I don't remember seeing other streets that were worked on.
Everything.
Really?
But of course, it's almost the summer, and they always take advantage of the summer to do major renovations to streets or whatever. But they really hit it hard in Montauban. You can't, and what they should do is train people into leaving their cars
somewhere else
outside the city. Take a bus, or I don't know if they're probably not ready for metro because it's not.
No,
that big.
It's not that big.
But a tram, do something,
right?
that people can take. That's quick and easy and cheap and don't let them park everywhere. That's it.
They may have some kind of shuttle. I mean, the thing about it is that it's
but from where I looked for it, I couldn't find it.
Nothing, huh?
I couldn't find a parking lot where I could stay. Either you park for free wherever you can, or you can only stay 30 minutes.
Well, the parking area in front of the cathedral, was it closed?
In front of the cathedral, yes, because they're digging up the
that's where I used to park.
Right? No, you can't park there.
You can't park there anymore.
You can't go there anymore. But that's where they're doing the underground parking lot,
right? Which
is a good idea. Unfortunately, it damaged the cathedral.
Right.
So,
which is a shame because on top of everything else, I mean, it's definitely Baroque style. It's not, unlike Toulouse, it's not a medieval city anymore. It's a classical. Right. It's a very elegant. I mean, the buildings that are there that are in brick are just really beautiful brick buildings. But it's 17th century. I mean, there's very little left from before then, and the Baroque cathedral is quite impressive inside.
And I do know that there are a lot of Protestants there because my first cousin married a Protestant, and his whole side of the family is all Protestant. I mean, just all of them, And
it has a whole heritage. It was the first city in the history of France to have two huge Protestant. They call them temples here. They don't call them churches, to distinguish them from the Catholic churches. It was the very first one. And of course, to have a school of theology for Protestants was revolutionary.
Yes,
it was a big deal.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's now in Montpellier. It's no longer in Montauban. They moved the School of Theology to Montpellier, which also a good part of the Southwest was in fact and stayed Protestant for a very long time. Yeah. We've talked about this a little bit. I know that some people react because they know that some of their ancestors came from this kind of a background. It is kind of interesting to see what happened and how many people did flee, unfortunately, and where they went when they didn't, and what cities they stayed in, So, what can we say?
Thank you so much, Elyse, for telling us all about that fascinating history. Really, I just, it's one thing to walk around the city and take photos, and quite another to understand how it got there.
Yes, and just like say, for those people who are interested in art or in painting and who are going to be in the area, whether they're in Toulouse, whether they're in Albi or any of those other places that are not far away, if you're interested, go to the museum because it really is filled with sculpture by Bourdelle, who was a very famous sculptor in the 19th century.
Do you have a statue of him?
Lots of round women, lots of really voluptuous round women.
Yeah, there's several of them.
Several of them, and a fair amount of work by Ingres.
But he also has they also have a Bourdelle statue by the Saint Jacques, whatever saint it is. Yeah.
He was also a native son.
Yeah,
two of them.
Yeah, I would say if you need a place to stay in the area, I would look for a hotel like somewhere else. Maybe Moissac would be a better choice.
Well, I don't think Moissac, personally, I don't think it's a good place to stay, but that's for other reasons. But it's definitely a place to visit for
yeah, but
history.
if you had to find a place to stay in the area, Albi would be better.
Albi would be better. The thing about Montauban is it has a very tiny city center, and then because it's a city that really expanded in the last 50 years, a lot of it is just expanded outward. So there are places to stay on the outside. It's not picturesque. But if you want to see something picturesque, you go to Albi.
Yeah.
Or you go to Negropélis, or you go to one of the smaller towns.
Negropélis.
I can't pronounce that.
Negropélis.
Negropélis. Or even Caussade, which is a little further north, it's not. I don't want to discourage people from going there if they are on the way somewhere else or in the neighborhood.
Sure.
But it's not a place that you're going to have for anything interesting for more than half a day.
It's not the obvious, everything is beautiful in France. No, not everything is beautiful in France. Yeah. Here's one example.
You have to know the history to understand why something can be interesting.
But the other one I've mentioned before is Castelnau, which is not being all torn up.
Right.
But still, it lacks basic charm. It's a fine place for people who are from there.
And who live there.
It's a fine place to live, but it's not a charming historical city.
Well, it's not set up. I think that's the other thing, that there are lots of places in France that really set things up and prettify everything because they want to attract tourists. That's what people do.
It's also better for the locals.
But probably that's probably not a priority.
Right, they just don't want to spend the money.
They just don't care.
Yeah, they don't care.
Well, there you are.
Merci, Elyse.
You're welcome, Annie.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Again, I want to thank my patrons for supporting the show and giving back. Patrons get several exclusive rewards for doing so. You can see them at patreon.com/join us. That's Patreon. Join us, no spaces or dashes. Thank you all for supporting the show. Some of you have done it for many years. You are wonderful. And a shout out this week to new patrons, Daniel Carl, Penny Wilcoxon, and Barbara von Gartner. Thank you so much for becoming patrons and making this podcast possible. I got home from Spain on Monday, and first thing Tuesday, I went on a walk with my dog, Opie. I was greeted back by the sights of gorgeous sunflowers and haystacks. It doesn't get any more French than sunflowers and haystacks, does it? Just ask Monet and Van Gogh, right? So later that day, I got on my bike to take my patrons on a ride with me to see the sunflowers and the haystacks. A happy place indeed. And several patrons have reacted saying, thank you for this relaxing video. This is a beautiful summer ride, etc. And, in a media landscape where most content producers look to shock and outrage people, I seek to calm and appease. And why not? Life can be peaceful if you know where to go. I hope you're having a peaceful, wonderful summer wherever you are. And thank you, patrons, for your support. Another way to support this podcast is to hire me to be your itinerary consultant. This is a popular service. I've been doing several a week. I'm hoping not to max out. But the way this works is we exchange some emails. I prepare an itinerary based on your needs, and then we spend an hour on the phone discussing it. If that's something you'd like to do, go to joinusinfrance.com/boutique. And please don't forget that if you can't get an itinerary review, another way to take me along with you is to get my voice map self-guided tours. Dawn returned from Paris to Los Angeles recently, and she says she had 2 glorious weeks in Paris. She followed my audio walking tours through Saint-Germain-des-Prés, Le Marais, Ile de la Cité, and Montmartre, and thoroughly enjoyed each one. The Join Us in France podcast has been my walking companion and sanity saver during all those walks to nowhere in my neighborhood in LA during COVID. It was so much fun to have Annie guide me through the neighborhoods of Paris now that we are finally able to venture out into the world again. The scenery was splendid. I learned a lot and discovered sights and stories that I never would have uncovered on my own. I am very impressed with the voice map technology. I have zero sense of direction and could get lost in a closet, but I always knew exactly where I was, where I was headed during each walking tour, thanks to the audio instructions and detailed map on my phone. And then she shared some photos and she says, I very highly recommended them. Thank you so much, Dawn. That's a very nice review. And yes, whether it's your first time in Paris or your 100th time in Paris, you will enjoy those tours. I can guarantee it. And again, you can find all of that at joinusinfrance.com/boutique. Today, I want to also thank Sarah Bast for sending in a one-time donation by using the green button on any page on joinusinfrance.com that says Tip Your Guide. Sarah wrote, thank you so much for your fantastic podcast. I'm finally about to leave for 10 days in France with my husband and 3 kids. Over a year later than we originally planned. Yes. Paris, Alsace, and Chantilly. I feel well prepared thanks to your podcast. Well, thank you, Sarah. Wishing you a wonderful time in Paris. About last week's episode about Aise, Yuri said, thank you for the warning about the difficulties for car parking. This is true on the French Riviera everywhere, but Aise is in a class of its own when it comes to parking, unless you're staying at the Chateau Aise Hotel, and then there's valet parking. Gregorio says, watch out for cruise ship passengers in a small place like Aise, which is an excellent point. A few buses of cruise ship passengers, and it'll be crowded as all get up. Not that there are any cruise ships right now, but they'll come back, and it's good to be warned. Phil says, it's cacti and not cactuses. I will take that under advisement. But I like cactuses personally. And I get to massacre English, okay? It's not my native tongue. And going back to parking in Aise, Brianne told me about a parking lot 3 kilometers away that has a free shuttle to the bottom of the medieval city and even gives free tickets to the garden sometimes. So I've added it to the show notes for the Aise episode. And also I wanted to mention that in this week's episode that you just heard, I mentioned a couple of times how disturbing it is to me that they still allow parking along the river in Montauban. And I saw somewhere that in 1962, the Louvre courtyard was also a parking lot. Can you imagine? No Louvre pyramid, but instead a bunch of smelly, noisy cars and the pushy behaviors that come with them. I'll post a photo on the Join Us in France closed group on Facebook tomorrow. We've come a long way, and some places still have a long way to go. So come on, Montauban, you can do it. Pedestrian downtown is the way to go. This week in French news, I'm getting a lot of questions about what the future holds from people who are hoping to visit France soon. The situation in France is not great. We are definitely experiencing a fourth wave of COVID, but it's different than what you're experiencing in the US. Unlike the CDC, European health authorities never said it's okay to go maskless, even if you've been fully vaccinated. As a result, mask compliance is still very good in France, where I live, and I saw that it was very good in Spain too, where I was recently. But there are indoor places where you cannot wear a mask. By that I mean restaurants mostly. And those places are open, so the virus has plenty of opportunities to find new hosts. Vaccination rates are now marginally better in France than in the US. This is turning out to be the tortoise and the hare. The tortoise has caught up and is still going. Macron has set a goal of 50 million French people fully vaccinated by the end of summer. Then he clarified that what he meant was the end of August. We will reach and exceed that goal, which means that by the end of August, which is right around the corner, as I'm recording this on July 31st, we should have 80% or more French people fully vaccinated. The number of vaccine appointments are still going up, plus 16% compared to last week, but it takes time to give people 2 shots 4 weeks apart. And then after you've had the second shot, you need to wait a week until you can get your magical QR code. So there are a lot of people pushing to get this done as fast as possible. People are asking me if I think there will be more lockdowns. It all hinges on hospital capacity. We're at 21% full capacity in mainland France, but in some territories where they don't have lots of hospital beds, such as Martinique and Guadeloupe, we've already reached hospital capacity, so they have more restrictions already. Could this happen in Paris? Probably not, but I can't predict the future. My guess is no, there will not be severe lockdowns anymore. But indoor places where you cannot wear a mask are at risk of being closed again. Although we have the ace in the pocket thing that I will mention in a second. Macron is still doing his best to make sure people get vaccinated as soon as possible. Kids 12 and up can get vaccinated against COVID-19. So when school starts up again, when a new case of COVID is confirmed in a classroom, unvaccinated teens will have to stay home and do remote learning, while vaccinated kids will be able to stay in school. Parents who did not intend to get their teens vaccinated are freaking out, which is what we want. You have to rattle those people or they will just sit and be undecisive forever. Lots of French parents don't want to risk having their kids at home if they test positive at some point. So off they send them to get vaccinated. Imagine that. I have a Facebook friend in France ask me if she should let her 13-year-old decide for herself if she should get vaccinated or not. And I think people who believe they have a choice are really cute. Will they continue to give their kids a choice when this virus starts killing kids? No, they won't. The reason they think that they have a choice is because they don't understand the science and they are susceptible to all the mixed messages that they get online and wherever they go. Fine, let them wring their hands all they want, but put them in the situation where it's best for them to get vaccinated because vaccines are how we get out of this pandemic. How do you keep track of infection numbers and vaccination rates in France? For those of you who are still trying to decide if you want to come or not, use covidtracker.fr. That's where you can see that even though we started out slow, we are still going strong. Now, the question everybody wants to know about, how do you get the QR code? This is how it works in France. Only people who have 2 doses of the vaccine or had a PCR test no longer than 2 days ago and were negative can get into most indoor venues. And once they're inside, they'll wear a mask or will be escorted out by security. Okay, at restaurants, you can't wear a mask, okay? But at least you know that the people next to you at the restaurant are not likely to be spreading the virus. Is that safe enough for you? You decide. I know for a fact that it's not that tight in the US, okay? The thing is, to make access efficient, we have to use QR codes and not vaccine cards. We know that vaccination centers, especially the one by Notre-Dame de Paris, had so many Americans showing up asking for a QR code that they stopped doing it the next day. That vaccination center can now send people to the Hôtel Dieu right next to the Parvis de Notre-Dame. So if you're facing Notre-Dame, you have the river on your right, and on your left, you have a big building. That big building is called the Hôtel Dieu, and it's not a hotel at all. It's a hospital. It's kind of a different kind of hospital. It's a hospital where people mostly go for follow-up appointments and appointments with specialists, okay? But still, they have a lot of administrative staff, so it makes sense that they are dedicating staff into turning CDC cards into QR codes. How long will you be able to go to the Hôtel Dieu? I don't know, but right now it's working. So if you're in Paris right now, try that. This week, I have not heard of a single American being turned away anywhere with their CDC vaccination card, but it's clear that there needs to be a process by which American visitors can get the health pass or QR code, so it's fast and easy for everyone. Because, you prepare your QR code, you show it, in you go. No questions asked. With a vaccine card, they have to look at it. They have to compare it to your ID. I mean, it's a lot more complicated. And lots of people are emailing the French consulate in the US, which is where we should be getting our information, where Americans should be getting their information. And one person got this response. Starting August 2nd, a health pass unit will be opened at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which will be able to fulfill these requests once the traveler has arrived. This episode is getting released on August 1st. I'll keep an eye on that tomorrow. If anything earth-shattering happens, I will post it on Facebook and I will email my subscribers about it, okay? But it looks like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is on the job and will be providing guidance very soon. Lachlan Cook, who's been on the podcast and has been a friend of the podcast for a long time, stopped in at the Join Us in France closed group on Facebook to recommend a cool site that lets travelers find out what's required to travel to France right now. And not just to France, but anywhere. So from anywhere to anywhere. So you set your country of departure and the country you're visiting, and it'll give you a list. The site has kind of a complicated name. It's apply.joinsherpa.com. I'll put a link in the show notes. Not only does Sherpa let you see the requirements to come to France, but also the requirements to go home at the end of your trip. And they also give you the documents that you need to fill out. So that's a very, very useful site. As far as getting a COVID test in France, you can make an appointment at any pharmacy in France. It's not free. The cost is 29 euros for the antigen test and 49 for PCR. So it depends on which one your country requires. Do not leave this until the last minute because, you need to stop by a pharmacy 5 days before your departure because a lot of pharmacies are getting slammed. They are getting a lot of requests for tests and they won't be able to take you on the day you inquire. So give it some time. But any pharmacy can help you. For my personal update this week, my husband and I are planning on a long weekend in Bergerac in the Dordogne next week. We'll take our bikes because they have a lovely voie verte that goes along the Dordogne River. I'll bring my little camera, and if the footage is any good, I'll make a video for patrons. And I want to remind you that anyone who has come on the podcast, Facebook group moderators, folks who send in a tip or become patrons, all have access to these video rewards with their login to addictedtofrance.com. If you don't have a login, and you should, let me know. I will make you one. And this is kind of a silly thing, but I have to mention it. You know how everyone wants two-step authentication right now? To do anything online, you need two-step authentication, right? You need a password, but they also send you an authentication code to your cell phone. Well, I have a bank account in Spain that I used to pay all the bills for my apartment in Spain. And that bank, the bums, locked me out of my account because they won't send a code to a French cell number. That's really horrible customer service, but guess what other country has this problem? The USA. Most services in the US will not send a verification code to a non-US number. So we have a special phone with a special US number, cell number, so we can get text messages. So I needed a Spanish cell number, ASAP. So I took care of that. I got a really inexpensive SIM card with a Spanish number. I put the card in my iPhone. I discovered that I did not enjoy the process of swapping SIM cards because, you have to get the PUK right. You have to get all the codes right. I was sweating bullets. Just getting the card out was difficult because I have an old phone. Anyway, I decided I should really look for a cheap cell phone that would be dedicated to my Spanish card. You're probably wondering, why the heck am I telling you all of this? Well, this led to a small revolution of sorts for me. I've been an iPhone girl forever, since iPhone 3S, actually. So I think 18 years I've had iPhones. I've had a lot of them. I use a Windows computer. I'm used to Windows, but I was iPhone all the way. My husband and daughter have Android phones, but I resisted. I bit the bullet every 3 years and paid an outrageous amount for iPhones. My iPhone 10 is now 3 years old, and it won't hold a charge for more than 3 hours. And honestly, none of my iPhones have been any good past the 3-year mark. I think that's what most people experience. So I got a Chinese phone. It's a Xiaomi phone. It works on Android, and it was 175 euros. And I cannot believe my eyes, but that cheap Chinese phone rocks. I'm thinking of swapping SIM cards and using the Xiaomi for every day and keep the iPhone 10 for my Spanish number. Has this happened to any of you? Am I going down the path of perdition? What's next? A condenser microphone? Say it and so. So I do need to get as good at navigating Android as I am with the iPhone, but it's not that different, honestly. And that little cheap Chinese phone blew my mind. Show notes for this episode are on joinusinfrance.com/348, where you can see a recap of what we've discussed, as well as links to relevant resources. And if you enjoy the show, introduce a friend to the podcast and show them how to listen. Next on the podcast, an episode about something I bet you've never heard of: the debarkment of Provence, and specifically the liberation of the Mediterranean by the Allied forces. You've all heard about D-Day in Normandy and the liberation of Paris that happened from the west, the north. But there were 3 major military operations to push back against German forces in the Mediterranean. And those are rarely mentioned. The anniversary is coming up on August 15th. So I want to remember the Allied forces, lots of Americans and British forces who participated in those operations. And my mother talked about it sometimes. I'll share a funny story about that. So I'll talk about Operation Torch, which was in North Africa, November 1942. Operation Vesuve, that was Corsica, on October 1943. And Anvil Dragoon, Provence, August 1944. Send questions or feedback to Annie@joinusinfrance.com. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you join me next time so we can look around France together. Au revoir. The Join Us in France travel podcast is written, hosted, and produced by Annie Sargent and copyright 2021 by Addicted to France. It is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.